John McIntyre's body won't be found for 6 more years. Right now, at 11:47 p.m. on a freezing December night, he's been dead for exactly 9 years, strangled in a basement, while 2 FBI agents sat 3 floors above him in an office, reviewing paperwork on an unrelated case. The same FBI agents who'd assured McIntyre his cooperation would be protected, who'd promised him safety in exchange for information about gun-running operations to the IRA, who had no idea their informant was being tortured and killed by another FBI informant, who'd learned about McIntyre's cooperation from their own confidential files. That other informant, the one doing the killing, was James Whitey Bulger, 55 years old, head of South Boston's Winter Hill Gang, and the most protected criminal in American history. For the past 19 years, since 1975, Bulger had been providing information to the FBI about Italian mafia operations in Boston. In exchange, the FBI had given him something far more valuable than money: immunity. Not official immunity. That would require paperwork, oversight, legal justification. But practical immunity, the kind that meant FBI agents warned Bulger about investigations, tipped him off to informants in his organization, and deliberately looked the other way while he built a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. John McIntyre was Bulger's 19th murder victim, killed while under active FBI protection. 19 men dead over 20 years, while federal agents filed reports describing Bulger as a valuable asset whose information had led to significant mafia prosecutions. 19 families destroyed while the FBI justified their relationship with a mass murderer by claiming he was helping them bring down a greater evil: the Italian mafia families that controlled New England's organized crime. But here's what makes Whitey Bulger's story different from every other FBI informant scandal in American history. The FBI knew he was killing people. They had reports, they had evidence, they had witnesses who came forward describing Bulger's murders in detail. And they buried it all, hid it from local police, concealed it from federal prosecutors, and continued protecting Bulger because admitting they'd created a monster would have destroyed careers, triggered congressional investigations, and exposed the FBI's methods as fundamentally corrupt. The question isn't why Whitey Bulger killed 19 people while supposedly working for the FBI. The question is why the FBI let him do it, facilitated it by providing him with intelligence that identified threats to his organization, and continued the relationship for 20 years, even as the body count mounted and evidence of his crimes became impossible to ignore. 20 years earlier, September 1975. James Joseph Bulger Jr. wasn't supposed to be anyone important. Born in 1929 in Dorchester, Massachusetts, he'd spent his youth bouncing between street gangs, armed robberies, and eventually federal prison. Sentenced to 20 years at Alcatraz for bank robbery in 1956. He served 9 years, got released in 1965, and returned to South Boston with a reputation for violence, but no real power. By 1975, he'd worked his way into the Winter Hill Gang, a predominantly Irish-American criminal organization that controlled gambling, loan sharking, and drug distribution in South Boston. The gang was run by Howie Winter, with Bulger as one of several lieutenants handling street-level operations. But Bulger had something the other lieutenants didn't: a younger brother, William Bulger, who'd become president of the Massachusetts State Senate. The connection gave Whitey political cover, made him seem more legitimate than a typical street thug, and attracted the attention of FBI Special Agent John Connolly. Connolly was South Boston Irish himself, had grown up in the same neighborhoods as the Bulger brothers, and believed he could turn Whitey into a confidential informant against the Italian mafia. The FBI's priority in 1975 was dismantling the Patriarchate crime family, which controlled organized crime across New England from its base in Providence, Rhode Island. The Patriarchate family had been operating for decades, had survived multiple prosecutions and represented the kind of old-world mafia structure that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had spent his career fighting. Connolly's pitch to Bulger was simple: provide information about the Patriarca family's operations in Boston, and the FBI would protect Bulger's own criminal activities from prosecution. Not officially. There would be no written immunity deal, no formal agreement that could be subpoenaed or reviewed. Just an understanding between Connolly and Bulger that information would flow one direction and protection would flow the other. Bulger agreed, with conditions. He wouldn't testify in court. That would mark him as a rat and end his credibility in the underworld. He wouldn't provide information that could be traced back to him directly. And most importantly, the FBI would tell him about any investigations targeting his organization, any informants who might be cooperating against him, any threats to his operations. Connolly agreed to all of it. On September 18, 1975. James Whitey Bulger was officially opened as a confidential FBI informant, designated BS 154-4-OC in Bureau records. The OC stood for Organized Crime. What it should have stood for was Out of Control. The arrangement, 1975 to 1980. For the first 5 years, the arrangement seemed to work exactly as Connolly had promised. Bulger provided information about Patriarca family operations, locations of illegal gambling operations, names of made members conducting business in Boston, details about loan sharking and drug trafficking. The information was solid, actionable, useful for building cases. In exchange, Connolly protected Bulger in ways that went far beyond normal handling of confidential informants. When local police departments developed cases against Bulger's organization, Connolly warned him in advance. When other criminals tried to cooperate against Bulger, Connolly told him their names and what they were saying. When federal investigations threatened to sweep up Bulger along with his targets, Connolly made sure those investigations either excluded Bulger or provided him advance warning. But Bulger was doing more than running a criminal organization. He was killing people. The first murder attributed to Bulger during his time as an FBI informant was Eddie Connors, killed in 1975 after Bulger learned, from Connolly, that Connors was providing information to local police. The second was Tommy King, killed in 1975 after a dispute over territory. The third was Buddy Leonard, also 1975, killed for similar reasons. Connolly knew about the murders. He filed reports describing Bulger as a violent criminal who would not hesitate to use force to protect his interests. But he justified continuing the relationship by claiming Bulger's information was too valuable to lose. The logic was circular and corrupt. We need Bulger's information to prosecute the mafia, so we'll ignore his murders, which makes him trust us more, which gets us better information, which justifies ignoring more murders. By 1980, Howie Winter had been convicted on federal racketeering charges. Bulger, protected by Connolly, wasn't charged in the same case, despite being deeply involved in the same criminal activities. With Winter in prison, Bulger took control of the Winter Hill Gang, partnering with Stephen Flemmi, who was also an FBI informant, handled by a different agent, but coordinating with Connolly. Now the FBI had 2 informants running Boston's most powerful Irish gang, providing information about Italian mafia operations and killing anyone who threatened their empire. The situation had evolved from morally questionable to absolutely corrupt. But Connolly defended it by pointing to the convictions his informant's information had generated. 14 Patriarca family members prosecuted between 1975 and 1980. Millions of dollars in illegal operations shut down. Significant progress in the FBI's campaign against New England organized crime. What he didn't mention in his reports was the body count. 9 murders attributable to Bulger and Flemmi between 1975 and 1980. 9 people dead, while under the supposed watch of their FBI handlers. The escalation. 1981 to 1990. As Bulger's power grew, so did his willingness to eliminate anyone he perceived as a threat. The murders became more frequent, more brutal, more indicative of a man who understood he was untouchable as long as he maintained his FBI relationship. In 1981, Roger Wheeler, a businessman who owned World Jai Alai, was murdered in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Bulger and Flemmi had been skimming profits from World Jai Alai operations and feared Wheeler was going to expose them. The contract was carried out by John Martirano, another Winter Hill associate, who shot Wheeler in the face in a country club parking lot. The FBI knew about Bulger's involvement. Connolly had filed reports indicating Bulger had an interest in World Jai Alai operations. But when local police in Tulsa and Boston began investigating Wheeler's murder, Connolly ensured that Bulger's name wasn't included in investigative reports shared with other agencies. In 1982, Brian Halloran approached the FBI with information about the Wheeler murder. He'd been approached by Bulger about participating in the killing, had declined, and now wanted to trade information for protection. The FBI assigned agents to meet with Halloran, collected his statement, and documented his claims that Bulger had ordered Wheeler's murder. Then Connolly told Bulger that Halloran was cooperating. On May 11, 1982, Bulger and an associate shot Halloran to death on a South Boston street in broad daylight. Halloran and another man, Michael Donahue, were gunned down while sitting in Donahue's car. Donahue wasn't involved in any criminal activity. He'd simply offered Halloran a ride, and died because he was in the wrong car at the wrong time. The FBI had failed to protect a witness who'd come forward with information about a murder. They'd allowed their informant to kill that witness using intelligence provided by the agent handling him. This should have ended the FBI-Bulger relationship immediately. Instead, Connolly justified it by claiming Halloran's information wasn't credible, that protecting Bulger's cover was more important than preventing a murder, that the larger goal of prosecuting the Patriarca family justified accepting some collateral damage. Over the next 8 years, Bulger killed 10 more people. Deborah Hussey, murdered in 1985 because she knew too much about Bulger's operations. John McIntyre, murdered in 1984 after the FBI told Bulger he was cooperating. Arthur "Bucky" Barrett, killed in 1983 after being forced to turn over $1 million from a bank robbery. Deborah Davis, killed in 1981 because she was Stephen Flemmi's girlfriend and wanted to leave him. Each murder was documented in FBI files, not as crimes to be prosecuted, but as information provided by a confidential informant about criminal activities in the Boston underworld. Connolly's reports described the murders in clinical language, as if Bulger were merely reporting on crimes committed by others, rather than committing them himself. The protection. 1988 to 1995. By 1988, evidence of FBI corruption was becoming impossible to hide. Local police departments in Boston were furious that federal agents seemed to be protecting Bulger while claiming to fight organized crime. The Massachusetts State Police had built cases against Bulger that mysteriously fell apart when witnesses disappeared or evidence was suppressed. In 1988, a federal task force was formed to investigate Bulger's organization. The investigation, called Operation Beans, was supposed to use wiretaps and surveillance to build a racketeering case, but every time investigators got close, Bulger seemed to know in advance. Operations were moved at the last minute. Meetings were rescheduled. Evidence disappeared. The reason was obvious. Connolly was still providing Bulger with details about the investigation. Even as a federal task force worked to build a case, the FBI agent who'd recruited Bulger was sabotaging their efforts to protect his informant. In 1990, federal prosecutors indicted several members of the Patriarca family on racketeering charges. The indictments were based significantly on information provided by Bulger and Flemmi. At the press conference announcing the charges, FBI officials praised confidential sources, whose cooperation had made the prosecutions possible. What they didn't announce was that those confidential sources had killed 19 people while providing that information, that they'd built a criminal empire worth an estimated $25 million annually, that they'd corrupted federal law enforcement to the point where FBI agents were actively protecting murderers in order to prosecute other murderers. By 1994, the situation was untenable. John Connolly had retired from the FBI, but other agents were continuing his practices. The body count was mounting. Local law enforcement was openly accusing the FBI of corruption. The Boston Globe was beginning to investigate the relationship between Bulger and the FBI. In December 1994, federal prosecutors finally moved to indict Bulger on racketeering charges. Not because new evidence had emerged, but because the political pressure had become too great to ignore. After 20 years of protection, the FBI was finally admitting they couldn't control their most important informant. But the warning came too late for the prosecutors, and too early for Bulger. John Connolly, even in retirement, maintained his relationship with his former informant. On December 23, 1994, he met with Bulger and told him an indictment was imminent. Bulger had 48 hours to disappear before the arrest warrant was issued. The flight, 1995 to 2011. Whitey Bulger went on the run on December 27, 1994, taking his longtime girlfriend, Teresa Stanley, and disappearing from Boston. Stanley returned after a few weeks, but Bulger remained in hiding for the next 16 years. He was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list in 1999, with a $2 million reward for information leading to his capture. The irony was savage. The FBI's most protected informant was now the FBI's most wanted fugitive. The bureau that had enabled his criminal career for 20 years was now hunting him with the same resources they'd used to protect him. Bulger's flight was professionally executed. He'd been preparing for this possibility for years, maintaining multiple identities, stashing cash in safe deposit boxes across the country, building a network of sympathizers who'd help him hide. He moved through multiple states, Louisiana, Wyoming, California, never staying long enough to establish patterns, never making contact with anyone from his former life. Meanwhile, in Boston, the full scope of FBI corruption was being exposed. In 1997, a federal investigation revealed that Connolly and other agents had provided Bulger with confidential law enforcement information for 20 years. In 2002, Connolly was convicted of racketeering and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, later increased to 40 years after he was convicted of second-degree murder for his role in John Callahan's 1982 killing. Families of Bulger's victims filed lawsuits against the FBI, claiming the Bureau's protection of Bulger had facilitated the murders of their loved ones. In 2006, a federal judge agreed, awarding over $100 million in damages. The FBI's relationship with Whitey Bulger was officially recognized as one of the worst law enforcement scandals in American history. Bulger was finally captured on June 22, 2011, in Santa Monica, California. He'd been living in a rent-controlled apartment under the name Charles Gasco with his girlfriend, Catherine Gregg. They'd been hiding in plain sight for 16 years, just another elderly couple in a beach community, unremarkable and unnoticed, until a tip from a former Iceland beauty queen who'd seen a news report led FBI agents to their door. The trial. 2013. Whitey Bulger's trial began in June 2013 in federal court in Boston. The prosecution presented evidence of 19 murders committed between 1973 and 1985. Witnesses, many of them former associates who'd turned state's evidence, described Bulger's criminal empire in detail. The murders, the drug trafficking, the extortion, the corruption of law enforcement. Bulger's defense strategy was to claim he'd never been an FBI informant, that he'd paid Connolly for information, but never provided any in return. It was a transparent lie. FBI files contained hundreds of pages of reports based on information Bulger had provided, but it allowed him to maintain his self-image as a stand-up criminal who'd never cooperated with law enforcement. The jury didn't believe him. After 32 hours of deliberation, they found Bulger guilty on 31 counts, including involvement in 11 murders. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. At age 83, he would die in prison. But the trial also exposed the full extent of FBI corruption. Prosecutors acknowledged that the Bureau had protected Bulger for 2 decades, that agents had provided him with confidential information, that the relationship had facilitated multiple murders. The testimony painted a picture of institutional failure, of an organization so focused on prosecuting one type of criminal that it enabled another type to operate with impunity. The end. October 30, 2018. Whitey Bulger was transferred to USP Hazleton, a high-security federal prison in West Virginia, on October 29, 2018. He was 89 years old, in declining health, confined to a wheelchair. Within 12 hours of arriving, he was dead. Inmates attacked him in his cell, beating him to death with a padlock stuffed into a sock. The murder was quick, brutal, and almost certainly planned in advance. Someone had known Bulger was being transferred, had spread the word, had organized the killing. The FBI investigated but made no arrests. The message was clear. Even in death, even after 23 years in custody, Whitey Bulger remained what he'd always been, a symbol of corruption so deep that justice was impossible, accountability was a joke, and the only resolution came from prison violence rather than institutional reform. The legacy. Whitey Bulger's relationship with the FBI destroyed lives, corrupted an institution, and exposed the fundamental flaw in using criminals to catch criminals. Eventually, the handlers lose control. The informants become more powerful than the agents running them, and the distinction between law enforcement and criminal enterprise disappears entirely. 19 murders over 20 years, while under FBI protection. 19 families destroyed, while federal agents filed paperwork justifying the relationship. 19 people who'd still be alive if the FBI had chosen to prosecute Bulger instead of protect him. The institutional response was predictable. Investigations, reforms, new policies for handling confidential informants. The FBI acknowledged that mistakes were made, that protocols were violated, that the relationship with Bulger represented a failure of supervision and oversight. But nobody in FBI leadership faced criminal charges. Nobody was held accountable for creating the conditions that enabled a mass murderer to operate with federal protection. John Connolly, the agent who recruited Bulger and protected him for 20 years, remains in federal prison. He's the only FBI agent to face significant criminal consequences for the scandal. His conviction sent a message. Individual agents can be sacrificed, but the institution itself remains untouchable. The families of Bulger's victims received financial settlements, but no justice. Money from taxpayers, not from the agents who failed to protect their loved ones. Compensation that acknowledged wrongdoing without requiring anyone in power to accept personal responsibility. South Boston, the neighborhood Bulger terrorized for 3 decades, has gentrified beyond recognition. The housing projects where he ruled are gone, replaced by condos and organic grocery stores. The liquor store he used as his headquarters is now a yoga studio. The physical spaces where Bulger built his empire have been erased, sanitized, transformed into something that bears no resemblance to the violence that once defined them. But the lesson remains. In 1975, the FBI made a devil's bargain, trading short-term prosecutorial success for long-term institutional corruption. They created a monster, fed him intelligence that helped him kill 19 people, and protected him for 20 years because admitting they'd made a mistake was unthinkable. Whitey Bulger proved that the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones the FBI is chasing. They're the ones the FBI is protecting. That badges and guns don't guarantee righteousness. That institutional priorities can corrupt individual agents until they're indistinguishable from the criminals they're supposed to be fighting. 19 murders, 20 years, one FBI informant who was never really an informant at all, but rather a criminal who'd purchased federal protection by providing information about other criminals. The arithmetic was always unsustainable. You can't build justice on a foundation of enabled murder. Eventually, the bodies pile up high enough that even the most willfully blind institution has to acknowledge what it's created. December 23, 1994. John McIntyre had been dead for 9 years. His body wouldn't be found for 6 more. In that 15-year window between his murder and his discovery, the FBI continued filing reports describing Whitey Bulger as a valuable confidential informant whose information had been instrumental in prosecuting organized crime. They were right, in a sense. Bulger's information had led to prosecutions. He was valuable. He was instrumental. He was also a mass murderer who'd killed 19 people with FBI protection, including several people who'd tried to cooperate with the same agency that was protecting their killer. That's the legacy. Not the convictions, not the prosecutions, not the supposed success in fighting organized crime. The legacy is 19 bodies, 20 years of corruption, and the proof that America's premier law enforcement agency was willing to enable murder if it served institutional priorities. Whitey Bulger didn't corrupt the FBI. The FBI corrupted itself, and Whitey Bulger was smart enough to exploit that corruption for 2 decades until the whole rotten structure finally collapsed.